Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging into something really fascinating, right at that crossroads of biology, information, and, well, how we think about origins.
Yeah, it's a big one. We're looking specifically at an argument you hear quite a bit, especially when science and faith discussions come up.
Exactly. The source material you shared with us, it really zooms in on this one specific analogy.
Yeah.
Comparing DNA to, say, a book or a language.
That's the one. The thinking goes, you see a book, you see complex language, you just know a mind wrote it, right? Intuitively.
Right.
So the argument extends that if DNA is like a complex, a code, then shouldn't that also point to a mind, an intelligent designer?
Okay, so that's the core idea.
Yeah.
And our mission here, looking just at this material, is to really unpack the critique of that analogy. Why might it be, a bit shaky?
Or more than shaky, potentially. The sources suggest that using this analogy not just as like a helpful picture, but as the actual basis for a big conclusion.
Yeah.
Well, that could be deeply misleading.
Yeah. One source even calls it potentially a worst form of making science if you misuse it like that.
Exactly. So we're going to first lay out the argument itself because it does feel powerful. Then we'll get into some really interesting counterexamples the sources bring up.
Things that challenge that simple information equals mind equation.
Precisely. And we'll spend a good chunk of time really taking apart the DNA as a book comparison, seeing why the sources argue it just doesn't hold up when you look closely at what DNA actually is and does.
Okay, sounds like a plan. Let's start with the argument itself. It often comes up in connection with figures like John Lennox. How is it usually presented?
Well, the sources describe it as being presented as almost deceptively simple, very intuitive. It kicks off with something we all experience. You find a book, right? Or any piece of complex writing software code, maybe a poem.
Yeah, Hamlet didn't just appear.
Exactly. Your immediate automatic reaction is, someone wrote this. A mind, an author was involved. You don't think it just, randomly assembled itself.
Because language, structured text, that's a product of thought, of intention.
Right. It feels deeply embedded in how we understand the world. We recognize authorship. So the argument then takes that feeling, that intuition, and applies it directly to biology, specifically to DNA.
The code of life, the blueprint.
DNA has this complex sequence, this arrangement of base pairs. It's often talked about using information terms, code, language, information storage.
So the logic is, if a book needs an author because it's complex information,
then DNA, being this incredibly complex, information-rich system, must also need an author, a designer, a mind behind it all. That's the extension.
So it's presented as, see a book, infer an author, see DNA, therefore infer a mind. It seems like a very direct, almost obvious step, building on that strong gut feeling about books.
It absolutely has that pull. Our brains are pattern matching machines, and we're really good at spotting agency, especially when patterns look like something we know agents create, like language. So looking at DNA, that analogy feels quite natural, and this is the crucial point the sources make, relying on that feeling, that intuition, as if it's solid proof for a designer. That's where things get tricky.
That's the leap the critique focuses on.
Right. It's moving from a possibly helpful illustration to the very foundation of a massive claim about origins. And that's where the sources suggest it risks becoming this problematic form of argument, maybe even this worst form of making science, because it's leaning on a surface resemblance without showing the underlying mechanics are truly equivalent.
Which brings us to the counter-arguments. Your sources don't just say the analogy feels off, they bring evidence. And the first big one is this thing called SciGEN. Tell us about that.
Yeah, SciGEN is fascinating. It's presented in the material as a direct challenge to that simple link. Text equals mind. Basically, SciGEN was a computer program developed back in the early 2000s at MIT. It used something called a context-free grammar, and its whole purpose, kind of cheekily, was to automatically generate computer science research papers.
Automatically generate, like write them from scratch.
Exactly. But here's the key thing the sources emphasize. SciGEN is fundamentally unintelligent. It has zero understanding, no consciousness, no intention, no actual knowledge of computer science. It's just code following rules.
A mindless process.
Completely mindless, but, and this is where it gets interesting, it was surprisingly good at mimicking the look and feel of real academic papers.
How did it do that?
It had a library, basically, of technical phrases, jargon, sentence structures common in computer science papers, and it used its grammar rules to stitch these together into paragraphs that sounded plausible. Grammatically correct sentences, proper sections like abstract, introduction, results.
So it mastered the style, the syntax, but the actual content was what?
gibberish. Complete nonsense, semantically speaking. It could string together valid-sounding sentences, but the overall meaning was zero. It's like having perfect grammar but nothing to say. Fluency without comprehension, syntax without semantics.
Okay, that's weird enough. But the really startling part your sources mention is these papers got accepted.
That's the kicker. Yes. Some of these randomly generated, nonsensical papers were submitted to actual peer-reviewed academic conferences, and they got accepted.
Wow. So human experts looked at them and thought they were legitimate.
Apparently, yes. At least on a surface level. The structure, the language, the formatting, it was convincing enough to pass that initial review stage in some cases. It's a real-world demonstration.
That really does throw a wrench in the works, doesn't it? That feeling that if something looks structured like a text, a mind must be behind it.
It directly counters it. The sources use SciGEN as empirical proof that a process utterly devoid of mind or understanding can produce output that has the structural hallmarks we associate with intelligence. It looks like a book, or a paper anyway, but no authoring mind was involved in the writing process itself.
So SciGEN spits out something that looks like intentional writing, but it's just rules and randomness.
Exactly. And that forces you to ask, if a simple mindless algorithm can do that for text, why assume that a complex biological structure like DNA must have a mind behind it just because it looks complex and information-rich?
It breaks that direct inference.
It shows the inference isn't necessarily valid. The appearance of structure isn't proof of conscious authorship. Maybe DNA is less like a book written by an author and more like the output of SciGEN complex structure emerging from a non-semantic, rule-based process. It's a potent challenge to that core assumption.
Okay, SciGEN is a powerful point about structure emerging mindlessly. But your sources seem to argue the problem with the DNA as book analogy runs even deeper than that.
Oh, definitely. The material argues the comparison itself is fundamentally flawed. It's not just weak, it actively misrepresents what DNA is and how it functions. Using it as proof is building on a faulty foundation.
Misrepresents it how? What's the core problem?
The main issue, according to the sources, is a kind of category error. We're taking concepts from the world of human language meaning, interpretation, semantics, and trying to force-fit them onto biochemistry, which operates on causation and physical processing.
Right. A book is meant to be read, understood by a mind.
Yes. You decode symbols on a page to get meaning. DNA just doesn't work like that. The sources are clear. Nothing reads DNA in the sense of understanding a message. Its code isn't symbolic in that way.
So how does it work then, if it's not being read for meaning?
It works through biochemical causation. The sequence of bases on the DNA strand dictates, through a series of chemical steps involving enzymes and ribosomes and other molecules, which proteins get built or when genes get turned on or off. It's a physical chemical process.
So it's more like a template or a set of instructions that trigger chemical actions, not a message to be interpreted.
Exactly. Its meaning is its functional consequence in the cell's chemistry. What does this sequence cause to happen biochemically? That's utterly different from the semantic meaning of words in a sentence. DNA is processed, not interpreted.
I see. So applying language or book concepts is misleading from the get-go.
Yes, and the sources point to several specific features of DNA that really highlight the mismatch.
Like what?
Well, for one, huge chunks of the genome don't directly code for proteins. This used to be called junk DNA, though we now know some has regulatory functions. But still, imagine a book where most pages are filler or repeats unrelated to the main story.
It wouldn't make sense as a designed book.
Right. Also, DNA is full of repetitive sequences, duplications, bits that look like old errors or broken genes. It tolerates a level of redundancy and error that would completely ruin a book intended for clear communication.
Okay.
And then there's the fact that it's a physical molecule. A, T, C, G, these are chemicals. Their interactions are governed by physics and chemistry, not grammar rules or narrative structure.
And the origin is different too, right?
Critically different. The sources emphasize DNA evolved over vast timescales. Millions, billions of years of random mutations, duplications, rearrangements, all filtered through natural selection based on what worked biochemically for survival and reproduction.
Not like an author sitting down to write a coherent story.
Not at all. It's a historical accumulation, a product of tinkering and adaptation. That's why the sources use that striking image. If DNA is a book, It's one with maybe 3 billion letters, mostly not contributing to a clear plot, full of repetitions, lacking an index or clear chapters.
Doesn't sound like an intelligently designed manual.
It sounds, the sources argue, exactly like something shaped by a long, messy, unguided historical process. Not the mark of an author, one source says, but of a natural historical process.
So the analogy doesn't just fall short, it paints a completely wrong picture of how DNA actually functions and where it came from.
That's the argument. And this is crucial for why using it as proof of a designer is seen as problematic, potentially this worst form of science. You're basing a huge conclusion on a metaphor that fundamentally misrepresents the very thing you're analyzing.
You're substituting a relatable but inaccurate picture for the actual complex, non-intentional mechanisms.
Precisely. It prioritizes an intuitive feeling sparked by a flawed analogy over digging into the actual biochemical and evolutionary evidence.
Okay, so SciGEN challenges the structure implies mind idea, and the direct analysis shows DNA isn't really like a book anyway. But the sources bring in another example, right? Modern AI.
Yes. Things like ChatGPT, they serve as an even more contemporary, maybe even more powerful illustration of the same core point SciGEN made.
How so? How does ChatGPT fit in?
Well, the sources describe these large language models like ChatGPT as essentially very sophisticated statistical pattern matchers. They've analyzed unbelievable amounts of human text.
Books, websites, articles.
Yeah, everything. And based on that analysis, they learn to predict the most statistically probable next word or sequence of words given the words that came before.
So again, it's not thinking or understanding like a person does. It's complex math and probability based on language patterns.
That's the key distinction the sources highlight. There's no consciousness, no subjective experience, no genuine comprehension going on inside the AI as far as we know, yet.
Yet they can write incredibly convincingly.
Amazingly so. Essays, poems, code, conversations, often completely indistinguishable from human writing. This creates what the sources call an illusion of understanding, or synthetic fluency.
Fluent, but without real comprehension underneath.
Exactly. The AI can manipulate language symbols correctly, following the statistical patterns it learned, but it doesn't grasp the meaning behind the symbols in the way a human does.
Is that where the broken leg paradox example comes in? I saw that mentioned.
Yeah, that's a classic illustration. An AI might learn from its data that if you input, "I broke my leg," a highly probable following sentence is, "I won't be able to go to the cinema tonight."
Makes sense.
It knows the statistical correlation, but the sources argue it doesn't understand why. It doesn't know what a leg is, what breaking means physically, the pain, the immobility, what a cinema is, why you need to be mobile to get there.
It knows the words often go together, but not the real-world causal chain.
Precisely. It has the correlation without the causation or the underlying semantic understanding. And if such a non-conscious statistical process can generate output that is so complex, coherent, and human-like,
it further weakens the idea that you need a conscious mind to get that kind of structured, information-rich output.
That's the connection the sources make. It's another powerful example, perhaps even more potent than SciGEN, of complex, seemingly intelligent output arising from a fundamentally mindless process. It looks like the product of a mind, but the generation process itself isn't mental.
But what about the argument, well, humans made ChatGPT. Doesn't that just push the intelligence back a step? SciGEN, ChatGPT, they required intelligent designers to build them in the first place.
That's a very common counter, and the sources address it directly. They say, yes, of course, humans designed and trained these AIs, but that misses the point when you're using AI as an analogy to understand natural processes like evolution.
How does it miss the point?
Because the crucial element for the analogy is the process that generates the specific output, the text. In this case, once SciGEN or ChatGPT is built and trained, it generates its output mechanically, statistically. There's no conscious intelligence involved during the act of writing. The intelligence was in setting up the system, not in guiding each word choice in real time.
Okay, I think I see the distinction. The setup required intelligence, but the running of the program, the actual generation, is mindless.
Exactly. And the sources draw a parallel here with evolution. Evolution, in the scientific view, isn't a designer consciously making decisions. It's a process.
Natural selection, mutation.
Right. A set of natural mechanisms operating over vast stretches of time on populations of organisms, governed by physical laws and environmental pressures. And this unguided, iterative process generates complexity functional proteins, intricate organs, coded DNA sequences, without a mind directing it.
So the analogy is, Just like the process of AI text generation is mindless, even if the setup wasn't, the process of evolution is mindless, and both can produce outputs that look designed or intelligently structured.
That's the core argument. The existence of SciGEN and advanced AI empirically demonstrates that the appearance of design or complex information doesn't automatically necessitate a conscious, intelligent author at the point of creation. Therefore, inferring a designer for DNA based solely on its complexity or information-like structure is leaning on an intuition that these examples show can be unreliable.
And relying on that potentially unreliable intuition, especially when it's based on a flawed analogy like DNA as a book, is what the sources critique as potentially poor scientific practice.
Yes, because it seems to bypass the search for observable, testable, non-intentional mechanisms that can explain the phenomena, like the mechanisms of evolution or the algorithms behind AI. It jumps to an explanation based on analogy rather than demonstrated process.
Wow. Okay, this really chips away at that initial analogy. The sources also briefly mention some other related arguments, don't they?
They do. One is the idea that the universe itself is intelligible, that we can understand it using math and science, and that this very intelligibility points towards a rational mind behind it all. Like, the universe speaks our mathematical language, so someone must have written it that way.
That sounds plausible too. If the rules are rational, maybe the rule maker was rational.
It's an argument you hear,
Yeah.
but the sources counter this by suggesting it could be an anthropic fallacy. Maybe the reason the universe seems intelligible to us is because we evolved within it.
So our minds are adapted to this universe's rules because that's where we grew up, essentially.
That's the idea. Our cognitive tools, pattern recognition, logic, math, developed because they were useful for surviving and making sense of this specific environment. It doesn't necessarily mean the environment was designed for our minds, but rather our minds were shaped by the environment.
Our understanding fits the universe because evolution made it fit.
That's the perspective offered. And the sources add that, frankly, a lot of the universe isn't easily intelligible to human intuition. Think quantum mechanics, or general relativity, or dark energy. These require incredibly abstract, often bizarre-seeming mathematical frameworks that defy everyday common sense.
Good point. It's not all neat and tidy Newtonian physics.
Not at all. The sources also bring up a historical angle to frame the design argument.
What's that?
They compare attributing design to DNA based on its complexity to, say, ancient explanations for why things happen, like the idea that a stone falls because it inherently desires to be united with the earth.
Attributing intention or purpose to inanimate objects or forces.
Exactly. Before we understood gravity as a fundamental impersonal force, people might have explained it using intention or desire. The sources suggest that arguing for a mind behind DNA simply because it looks functional or information-rich might be a similar kind of reasoning attributing agency or intention, where a sufficient explanation might lie in impersonal natural processes.
So it's like defaulting to an agent explanation when a process explanation, like evolution acting on biochemistry, might be more accurate based on evidence.
That's the parallel they draw. It leads back to the core message repeated throughout the sources. Complexity, structure, function, even the appearance of meaning or design do not automatically logically necessitate a conscious mind or intention as their source.
Because we have examples where they don't.
Right. SciGEN, AI, and arguably evolution itself. The sources propose that seeing apparent design and jumping to a designer is a kind of cognitive shortcut. It's easy, it fits our experience with human artifacts, but in science, especially when dealing with the natural world's origins, we need to be wary of that shortcut.
And relying heavily on that shortcut, bolstered by a misleading analogy like the book comparison, instead of focusing on the actual, albeit complex, natural processes, that's the problematic approach to science the sources warn against.
Precisely. It risks substituting an intuitive, analogy-based inference for a more rigorous, evidence-based, mechanistic explanation.
Okay, let's try to pull all these threads together. We started with the basic argument presented by figures like Lennox. Books have authors. DNA is like a book or code, therefore DNA has an author mind. Very intuitive.
Right, leveraging that powerful feeling about language and complexity implying intelligence.
But then the sources brought serious challenges. First, SciGEN, a mindless algorithm creating papers that fooled experts, shows structure doesn't guarantee a mind was involved in the writing.
A clear empirical counterexample. Syntax without semantics is possible from a mindless source.
Then, modern AI, like ChatGPT, reinforcing this incredibly human-like text from statistical processing, showing synthetic fluency without actual understanding.
And crucially, the sources argue The human role in creating AI doesn't negate the point about the generation process itself being mindless, which is the relevant part for the evolution analogy.
Then we got into the deep flaws of the DNA as book analogy itself. It's just not how DNA works.
Fundamentally different functions. DNA is about biochemical causation, being processed chemically. Books are about semantic meaning, being interpreted by minds. Category error.
And the actual features of DNA, the non-coding regions, the redundancy, the errors, its physical nature, its evolutionary tinkered history, make it look very unlike a purposefully written book.
Making the analogy actively misleading if used as the basis for proof, according to the sources, it looks more like the product of a long, natural, historical process.
And finally, the broader points, the universe's intelligibility perhaps being an effect of our evolution within it, and the historical parallel of attributing intention before understanding natural processes.
All leading to the conclusion presented in the sources. Complex functional systems can, and apparently do, emerge from mindless iterative processes operating under physical constraints and selection pressures. We see it in algorithms, and the evidence suggests we see it in biology.
So the appearance of design can be a powerful illusion, or at least not definitive proof of a designer. Taking that appearance, propped up by a weak or flawed analogy as your main argument, that's where the sources suggest science goes wrong.
It highlights that critical need in science to move beyond surface appearances and analogies, however compelling, and focus on understanding the actual underlying mechanisms and processes based on empirical evidence.
It really forces you to question that initial intuitive leap. So the provocative thought from these sources might be, if seeing apparent design can be a cognitive shortcut, maybe even a trap based on flawed analogy, where else are we doing that?
Yeah, in what other areas, maybe even outside of science, are we quick to attribute intention or design based on complexity when maybe a deeper look at the process would reveal something different?
How does really scrutinizing our analogies, understanding when they help and when they mislead, change how we evaluate complex claims all around us? Something definitely worth pondering.
Absolutely. A good reminder to always ask about the mechanism, not just admire the pattern.
Couldn't agree more. That brings us to the end of this deep dive.